Good evening all, and welcome to part 4 of our US Every State Horror Story collection. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Nebraska. I'm a 40-year-old female, and this happened in 2004 when I was 20 years old. During this time, I was renting a room in an old Victorian house in downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. While living there, I worked third shift at the local Walmart and would typically get home from work at around 8 a.m. For context, the house I was living in was a 3-story house with the full basement, main floor and upper floor built in the late 1800s, and my roommate's parents owned the house, so the rent was very cheap. The main floor consisted of the living room, kitchen, and dining area. The main entrance of the house opened up into the living room with a stairway to the right, leading up to the second floor. On the far side of the living room, there was a door on the right side leading into the kitchen. In the kitchen there was a back door going out into the backyard, and a door inside the kitchen leading down to the basement. The 2 bedrooms were on the upper floor along with the bathroom. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, with a shared bathroom to the left. In my bedroom, I had my bed placed right up against the corner, so on the long side situated parallel from the bedroom door. I lived in this house for a little under a year and had multiple experiences while living there. The first was when I was in the living room with my roommate. Chris, a 23-year-old male, and I were sitting on the couch watching TV with a few friends from work, when out of nowhere there was a gust of wind, as if someone had walked right past us towards the stairs leading to the second floor. Accompanied with this rush of wind was an old-fashioned powdery perfume scent. Right when it happened, Chris muted the program we were all watching, and we all looked at one another with surprise. I asked the group if they felt and smelled that weird perfume, and they all nodded in agreement. The second experience I had happened on one of my night shifts off. Since I was used to working overnight by this time, I was awake in the middle of the night when most people would be asleep. I was laying in my bed with the lights dimmed, just listening to music. I remember I had my door open so that I could see down the hallway that led to the stairs to the main floor. I was home alone since Chris was at work, and the house had been dark and silent except for the occasional creaks and groans that one would think be typical for a house built so long ago. As I was relaxing, I saw something out of the corner of my eye coming up the stairs. I turned my head and couldn't believe my eyes. Slowly making its way around the stairwell towards the top, traveled a small bluish-white orb the size of a golf ball. The orb was glowing with a dense and luminous light, and I paused my music and took down my headphones and watched it intently. I watched as it now traveled up the hall toward me, and then continued to watch as this small ball of light floated right up to me and stopped about 2 feet from the side of my bed. It stayed in that spot for a few seconds, and in that moment I felt as if the light had an awareness, as if it was staring at me. After a few seconds, it just hovered there. The orb continued on its way, traveling past me, right through the closed door of the closet. I got out of bed and walked over to the closet, and slowly peeked inside but found nothing out of the ordinary. The little orb of light had disappeared almost as soon as it had appeared. I just kept thinking about how strange it moved, and how bizarre that it flew right through a closed door and then vanished. The third experience I had happened again on one of my nights off. I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, and right before I put my foot on the landing to the hallway, I heard a woman's voice say behind me, "Hello?" I was home alone when I heard this disembodied voice behind me, and the voice sounded like that of a young to middle-aged woman, mid-20s to early 30s. As soon as I heard the voice, I glanced behind me and saw there was no one there, and bolted to my bedroom. The fourth experience leading up to that one made me move out. It happened in the kitchen. One day after work, I was in the kitchen preparing a meal, when all of a sudden I heard a loud bang come from the basement. The sound I heard almost sounded like someone taking the lid to the washing machine and slamming it down as hard as possible. The only other person in the house at the time was my roommate, and I could see he was taking a nap in his recliner in the living room. I decided to go down to the basement to check out the sound. The basement always gave off a really heavy and oppressive vibe. No one liked going down there, but that's where we had our washer and dryer, as well as furnace and storage. The light to the basement was at the top of the basement stairs, and I grabbed a big flashlight that we kept under the sink for good measure. Then I turned the light on the top of the stairs and slowly descended down into the basement. As soon as I started down the stairs, I noticed how freezing cold it was. It was so cold I could see my breath. This alone made me stop. The feeling of uneasiness growing in my stomach with each passing second, and I stood on the steps for a few seconds when all of a sudden the light at the base of the stairs began swinging back and forth. And then after a few seconds, the back and forth became a circular motion. The circles began to get more and more violent, to the point where the light fixture looked as if it may snap off. At this, I ran back up the stairs and into the kitchen, and shut the door to the basement behind me. From that day forward until I moved out, I did my laundry at the laundromat, because I was too scared to step 1 foot back into that basement. The next experience was the straw that broke the camel's back. For context, I would typically take a nice hot shower after work as part of my after-work unwinding process. One day after work, I was doing my typical routine of taking a shower. After my shower, I wrapped myself in my towel as I normally did and went right into my bedroom. I sat down on the edge of my bed, and a moment later felt the bed move slightly, as if someone had put additional weight on it. I looked around and didn't see anything. I thought it was just my imagination and began to brush it off when the bed moved again. It was then that I looked to my left and felt someone sit down next to me. And it wasn't only that I felt them sit next to me, I watched in horror as an impression where someone sat down formed next to me into the mattress. I jumped back, scrambled over to the other side of the mattress and pressed myself against the wall, never taking my eyes off the compressed spot. That was until the thing moved towards me. I saw it as it moved slowly towards me. There were smaller compressions, as if it were crawling on all fours, and I screamed and began to try to get off the mattress with one arm holding my towel around my body. At this point, the whole mattress began to vibrate, and mind you, this was just a regular full-sized mattress, and I was the only one home. As I tried to crawl off the end of the mattress, the whole bed seemingly lifted, and in this moment, I let go of the towel and held onto the mattress with both arms as it jumped and shook, as if someone was shaking the mattress as violently as they could. The best way I can describe the way the mattress was moving is if you've ever seen those rope workouts where people shake giant ropes in alternating wave motions. The whole mattress was moving in a powerful unilateral or alternating wave motion, with both long sides of the mattress moving up and down in such a way that would have been impossible for a human to do. The violent shaking lasted, 10 seconds or so, and then abruptly ended. Right when the mattress fell limp, I grabbed my now half towel and my car keys that were on the hook by the door and bolted out the house. It was broad daylight, but I ran out wet, half naked, and with my keys. I didn't even take the time to find my phone or shoes. I ran down the stairs and flew out the back door. I hung out in my car until Chris got home. I remember just sitting there trying to catch my breath and do my best to calm myself down. When Chris got home, I told him about it. I went in long enough to grab a pack for a few nights away and got a hotel room. When I went back, I apologized, but told Chris there was no way I could live there after what happened. Given the previous happenings in the house, Chris was understanding, and there were no hard feelings. I was saddened to learn Chris had died in that house only a few years after I had moved out. He was 27 with no history of illness. It had been his parents who found him after a week of not hearing from him. Supposedly, Chris had died from complications with the flu, and he was discovered passed away sitting in his favorite chair in the living room. Chris did not get another roommate and had been living alone since I moved out. I think about him from time to time and pray he's living it up wherever he is now. I will say one last thing though. Although I never looked into the history of the house, I always felt that there were two entities in there, one good, one bad. I believe the good one was responsible for the powdery perfume scents that occasionally filled the air and the disembodied voice in the orb, while the evil one was responsible for the violently swinging of the light, loud banging noises, and the mattress incident. That is completely up for speculation, of course, and not something we will ever know. One thing I do know is this: the things I experienced while living at that house have changed my life forever. And thank you for listening to my story. New Hampshire. This first story takes place when I was 12, when I was an innocent and naive 6th grader. I was regularly bullied during middle school. Most of it I brushed off as it was mostly trivial things like name-calling. But there was one bully, however, that went above and beyond the trivial stuff. The first and only bully I genuinely feared. Now Carson was a grade above me, much taller. In fact, for a 7th grader, he had the build of an adult, and he knew this. He was not afraid to yell, get in your face, and push you around to get what he wanted. He bullied me through the majority of the 6th grade, but after an intervention from my very angry mother, may she rest in peace, Carson's angry facade crumpled away instantly and was replaced by crying and apologies. Myself or my friends never had to deal with Carson again until 1 year later. In May of my 7th grade year, I was hanging out with my two best friends at the time, Thomas and Everett. Everett was my age, while Thomas was a year older, at 14. We all lived in the same neighborhood, so we would frequently stop by each other's houses to hang out and explore town. On this particular day, Thomas had brought his friend Charles with us, and we had decided we would all head towards the river that bisected our town. On the way there, a familiar face pulled up next to us on his bike. One that still shot a pang of uneasiness into my subconscious even a year later. Carson. Him and Charles were apparently cordial at the time, which was something I did not know about. They hit it off, and after a bit Carson even talked with me. To my surprise, not trying to bully me at all, and this helped my unease a bit. But after a while, Carson suggested we go to his secret hangout spot by the river. Although I was unsure about this, everyone else in the group wanted to go down, and through the power of teenage peer pressure, I relented and joined them. This secret hangout spot was just off the trail from Powder House Point, a historical landmark in my hometown. At one point during the 1700s, my hometown was the capital of New Hampshire, and as such a small brick powder house was constructed on the riverbank just outside the downtown area. The gunpowder stored here went on to be used in several significant battles during America's infancy, such as Bunker Hill and the War of 1812. In fact, half of New Hampshire's gunpowder supply came from this at one point, and in the years since, a new riverbank and trail was built into the river, creating a loop jutting into the river with a pond inside of it. The powder house itself still stands to this day, offering insight to a bygone era of New Hampshire and American history. After going into the tree line with my friends and Carson, we came across 3 large abandoned pipes in a small clearing. 2 other people were there that Carson knew, but I never found out who they were. These pipes were large, black sewer pipes, probably left over from the construction of the aforementioned trail loop, and unbeknownst to me, a place where middle and high schoolers often got up to no good. Some alarm bells started going off in my head, but no one else in my group was fazed by this, so I stayed. And after some small talk, one of the unknown guys produced a bottle of clear rum, and for 13-year-old me, that was the final straw. That was the first time I had ever been offered alcohol, and with the dare talks from my school still fresh in my mind, I was ready to go. Everett was also unsure at this point, but he didn't want to abandon Thomas. We could sense that Carson and friends were up to something, so we decided that Everett would stay and watch, while Thomas and I went home and found help. I raced home, slipping in the mud on the way and getting myself quite dirty, but I managed to make it nonetheless and informed my mum of the situation, who beckoned me in the family car as we drove to Thomas's house to inform his mum of the situation. While we were outside informing his mum, Everett showed up and informed us of what happened after I left. Apparently both Thomas and Charles had gotten extremely drunk, while Carson and friends were constantly egging them on to drink more and more while not drinking anything themselves. Everett told us he was able to convince Thomas to get out of there, much to our relief. He told us Thomas wasn't far behind, and as if on cue, Thomas stumbled into view at the end of the street in a drunken stupor. All three of us were able to get home safely, but we did not know the whereabouts of Charles. At that point, however, Everett and I were too scared to care, and Thomas was too drunk to care, and we did not know about his fate until the next day on social media. Apparently, after we left, the three friends decided to gang up and severely beat Charles to the point he had to go to the hospital. Our theory is that they might have been intending to fight and beat us up all along, and post about it on social media for clout. They not only picked a secluded spot off the known trails, but used alcohol to attempt to impair us while having none themselves. I think my lucky stars, my friends and I were able to get out of there in time before one of us got hurt. I don't know if Carson ever got punished for his actions. It's possible that he got punished through the school system, and I never found out about it, but it happened too long ago to know for sure. It's a shame this event had to happen on such a beautiful trail, as for years I avoided the area entirely. As an adult, when I'm in the area, I will occasionally visit Powder House Point to take in the scenery, but to this day, when I walk by the part of the trail where the incident took place, I keep my guard up. Nevada. For context, I'm a guy living in a small town in Nevada. Now this town can get a bit boring sometimes, especially if you're not into the whole gambling, nightlife thing. However, there are a couple of things I enjoy doing, like off-roading in my ATV or going for long hikes with my dogs Buddy and Snoopy. Now right behind my house is a desert that stretches out for miles, which makes it super convenient for me to walk my dogs, because I don't have to worry about traffic or other civilians. I can just let them run loose and enjoy the open space. Now there are also two large mountains a few miles from my house that I like to hike up. These mountains are only separated by less than half a mile. Now during these winters, these mountains can be pretty rough. The first mountain was easier to hike because of the clear trail leading up to it, while the second was more rocky and steep. Now, the day before I went to this particular hike, the weather was horrendous. Almost everything was snowed in, and the wind was powerful enough to knock a semi-truck over. But by the morning, a lot of it had cleared, and the wind had settled down. Not the perfect weather, but I still decided to go for my hike. My dad didn't think it was a good idea to go alone, and he and my aunt joined in. Instead of taking the usual route to the first mountain, my aunt wanted to hike up the second because the sun was hitting that side. I was hesitant at first because of the steepness, but finally agreed and we were on our way. The desert ground was pretty muddy and the bushes were covered in snow. Light snowflakes were hitting our face and the sky was finally starting to clear up. As we approached the second mountain, we noticed tire tracks on the snowy trail that looked like they'd been there for more than a day. We thought it was pretty strange, because who would be out here driving in this weather? But we brushed it off. Now, one thing that intimidated me about this mountain were the sharp rocks on the trail that we had crossed. These rocks looked even more intimidating, covered in ice and snow. Luckily, we carefully crossed these rocks and made it to the top of the mountain, exhausted, but we were just happy we achieved our goal. The top of the mountain didn't look as how I expected it to. There were food wrappers, beer bottles, and dead bushes everywhere, but I still enjoyed the view and began taking some pictures of the dogs and the scenery with the town in the background. However, I noticed both of my dogs examining and sniffing around a dead bush. I called them over, but they wouldn't listen. So I went to grab them, and that's when I noticed what appeared to be burnt pieces of cardboard scattered around in the dirt. I thought at first it was trash. When I looked down to examine the burnt pieces, I noticed it was a piece of what appeared to be a photograph, like those really old face portraits with no colour. I could make out an eye in the piece that I picked up, and what was really strange was that the eye looked familiar. This sort of creeped me out. My father and aunt thought it was a bit weird, but didn't think much of it, and they were all ready to head back home. We got about 3 minutes down the mountain, but something made me want to return and examine the piece again. My dad and aunt agreed, and we all grabbed the pieces and struggled to match them together because of how burnt and damaged they were. It was sort of like solving a puzzle. Now, with all the pieces assembled, this made out to be an 18 by 20 photograph. It was pretty big. We stepped back to examine it, and we were horrified, as it was a photograph of my deceased grandfather. I was speechless. Who would do something like this? It was like a scene out of a scary movie, where all the viewers yell at you to run. I didn't know what to think. My mind started racing. We had this exact photo in our house, and I thought it was the only copy. So seeing this picture here, I thought someone had broken in, stolen it, and was trying to send us a message. I thought my family back home were in danger, or someone was trying to play a very sick joke. We picked up all the pieces and got the hell out of there. I tried to call my mum, and as we scurried down the mountain, my phone had no signal. My dad and aunt weren't as freaked out as I was. We had no energy to run, so we jogged our way back home as the wind was starting to pick up again and the sun slowly fading back to obscurity. The only thing on my mind was making sure my family were okay. I kept looking behind me because I was so freaked out of the situation, but thankfully nothing happened to us and we made it home and I saw my mum in the kitchen and my brother playing video games. She was confused as to why I was hugging her. That's when I finally explained to her the situation. I assembled all the pieces of the photograph and she was scared, as this was her father. She was as freaked out as I was, and I went to her room because I knew that's where she kept the photo of my grandpa, and it was still hanging on the wall undamaged. This puzzled me and my mum even more. She thought we were the only ones who had this photograph. My grandpa had lived in California all his life and was tragically gunned down there in front of his home by gang members. My mum was really small when his life was taken, and the guy who killed my grandpa were after my mum's older brothers too. So my family left town and settled here in Nevada. So the only explanation we had was that these guys found out where we lived and were trying to send us a message with the destruction of the photograph of my grandpa. That whole month we slept with one eye open and were very cautious of the things we did throughout the day. I no longer hiked up those mountains and would rarely come outside. I just wanted an answer as to who did this and what their intentions were. My mum wanted to share this with my grandma, but didn't want to frighten her. Eventually though, she had to, and found out that my grandma had owned a copy of this same photograph too. But what my grandma told my mum about the photo shocked her. My grandma said she was responsible for the photo being out there. She said that on the night before we took that walk, she told one of my uncles to take the photo and destroy it, because she felt a strange presence with the photo being in the house. She said anytime she would look at it, she would catch the eyes staring at her, no matter where she was in the room. And that's why, when I had seen the eye from the picture out in the desert, it creeped me out, because I had seen them before. One thing I still sort of question is how my uncle drove all the way up that mountain in that weather in the pitch darkness. We told him the story and he verified it, claiming that his brother went out drinking and drove all the way up the mountain in the dark. And they were trying to get rid of the picture. He said he tried burning it, but the wind was really strong, so he resorted to tearing it apart with his hands. It was really tough getting up the mountain, but he wanted to get the photograph as far away from my grandma as she could. One thing that's still strange to me is how we ended up finding all the pieces. Like it was fate. I mean, I never would have climbed down this mountain if it wasn't for my aunt. It's almost like the photo had wanted to remain in the family. Like I said, the wind was really strong the night before, and it snowed a lot. Yet the pieces didn't fly away and weren't covered in snow. They were all just laying close to each other. It's odd, in my opinion. New Jersey. I've always been what you might call sensitive to the paranormal ever since I was a little girl. So I live in a town that used to be part of a city. It has an old farmhouse dating back to the 1690s, back during the Revolution. My town and street was all farmland that the British Army marched through on the way to the Battle of Spanktown. And there is a historical house right by our borders that was where an active hotel during said battle was, and it has changed a few times, including being a Girl Scout facility and now a museum. This is where my first story takes place. When I was about 3 years old, my mum took me for a tour there. And on the second floor there was a large display room while we were touring the exhibits. While we were there, I noticed and spoke to another girl, a few years older than me, that was wearing a white dress. Eventually I went to my mum and told her that I made friends with the little girl in the white dress. My mum just told me, "That's nice," and took some pictures in the room. A few years later, when I was around 7, I realized how weird it was and asked my mum about it. She told me that there had never been another child in the room, and she actually had a photo of the little girl too. The photo would keep appearing and disappearing for several years before vanishing for good. Fast forward to 2021, and there's a ghost hunt in said house, to which my mum and I attend. And during said ghost hunt at one point we were all on the second floor, and the hunters pulled out a ghost box and asked us all to ask a question. When it came to me, I asked, "When I was a little girl, I saw and spoke to a little girl in a white dress. Do you remember me?" To which the box immediately replied yes, and after everyone freaked out, we continued to interact with the little girl. She had been a guest in the hotel back when it was functioning as one, not a Girl Scout like I thought. We sadly couldn't get too much information from her, but it was crazy that she not only remembered me, but recognized me. My other story has to do with my house, and is relevant to the Battle of Spanktown. When I was 5, I had been left home alone for about 10 minutes while my mum was shopping and my grandparents were in Germany. I was a good kid and knew not to answer the phone or door and to stay out of the view of windows. So I was upstairs watching SpongeBob and heard a weird bang coming from the hallway and the attic, so of course I turned to look. From where the drop area where our ladder is, I saw 2 men dressed as soldiers from the Revolution, one British and one Continental. The Continental soldier chased after the British one, shouting, "Stop, spy!" and they disappeared into the TV, which of course scared the ever-loving bejesus out of me. My mum thought it was my imagination when I told her about it, though how I could have imagined revolutionary soldiers when I hadn't even seen images of them before, I have no idea. Then when I was in middle school, the house from the 1690s had a revolution reenactment, and I heard the sound of muskets for the first time, and the sound was familiar. It was the sound I heard in the attic all those years before. Then, in between the periods of Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Sandy, I heard heavy boots walking in the attic over my bedroom almost nightly, ending just after Hurricane Sandy started. I was sure it was the soldiers. Then about a year after, around midnight one night, I awoke because I was on my left side, and while I'm a right side sleeper, I was about to turn around but felt two men staring at me over the bed. I could just feel that it was them, and that they were talking to me, though I didn't hear any voices. I just heard the feeling of, "It's okay. Go back to sleep, you're safe. But only if you don't turn around." My mum also woke around that time in her room and could feel 3 things walking through the hallway. The most negative thing, having a skull face and being escorted by the other 2. I think that thing was probably in my room at night, and those 2 were there to protect me from it. I'm grateful that was the last encounter I had with anything paranormal, and I'm grateful for it. When I was about 13, most of my adoptive parents' families lived in New Mexico, and we would make a trip every year to see them. This was the first time I had been able to bring a friend with me, and I wanted to bring my best friend of several years. Her name was Zoe. She was funny, sweet, and outgoing. We're both girls, by the way, and it was a big deal for me as I had never been allowed to bring a friend before, so it was super exciting, being an only child. You can imagine a 14-hour drive for a young kid with no siblings to pass the time, so the trip down there was incredible, and we had a great time. It passed so fast, I forgot how grueling it used to be to take the trip. Our first stop was to see the grandparents. That went smoothly and was great. We played in the garden and enjoyed spending time with the family. As the day passed, we finally jumped back in the car and headed about 30 minutes away to stay with my Aunt Karen and Uncle Dan. This is relevant because there is another pair of aunties and uncles that are relevant. So we usually stay with Aunt Jill and Uncle Jack, but this was different because they had their family over this time of year, which is fine because I liked Aunt Karen and Uncle Dan more. So my parents and aunt and uncle were talking about going to visit Uncle Jack and Auntie Jill and their side of the family. Zoe and I were really riled up, and were getting kind of tired of family at this point. Nothing against them, but there were already children going to be there, so more probably wouldn't have worked. They gave us some coupons to go to the Dairy Queen down the way. It wasn't unreasonably far to walk, especially after such a long drive. We had cell phones, so it wasn't that big of a deal. We stayed at the house for a little while, drank some water, refreshed ourselves, and decided to head out. Even as a 13-year-old girl, I carried a Swiss Army knife because I grew up in the country, and it's never a bad idea to have a tool or weapon when you go out alone. Zoe and I were heading out, enjoying our stroll, and there was no one driving around or walking, which was kind of strange, but we brushed it off because it was pretty hot out. My parents let us go alone because we were responsible and level-headed kids. We promised to call once we made it. So we're walking along, maybe a quarter, halfway there at this point, when I hear a faint static noise. I thought maybe the wind carried a wire or something. It just wasn't alarming, but it was a little weird, and I asked Zoe if she heard it, and she said she hadn't. I'm an overly cautious kid because, well, the way I grew up, I was observant and protective of my friends and family. I heard it again, and this time it was louder but sounded like really crappy ice cream truck music. And Zoe heard it too. She snapped her head up and looked at me, and we both realized we'd heard it. It was unnerving. It set me on edge, and I told her to walk to my right, so that I was closest to the sidewalk and she was closer to the yards and houses. I don't know why I did this, but it just felt right. It was a little extra, but I wasn't in my element, and we didn't have adults, so I thought it could have been a smart precaution. We couldn't hear it anymore. So we thought maybe it really just was an old ice cream truck that finally closed for the day. Maybe the batteries were low on the player, I don't know. We're about halfway there. All of a sudden, I see this sketchy-ass van pull around the corner with very tinted windows, and I immediately felt very scared. It was driving very, very slowly, and I was confused. I didn't know why they didn't just drive normally down the road, until it turned the music on. It was the same creepy ice cream truck music we'd heard earlier. We obviously didn't want ice cream because we didn't run towards it, and I told Zoe to ignore it and stay close to the houses. I told her if it kept following us, we'd just run directly to a house and knock on the door. I wanted to make sure we had a plan before we just got scared and panicked, so we agreed and ignored the truck. All of a sudden, it started to pick up pace behind us. We heard the engine rev up, and we knew it was speeding up from the creepy crawl it had been doing following us. I yelled at Zoe to run for it. The nearest house without a gate was a little way down the road, so we hoofed it. I made sure that Zoe ran through the open gate before I did, and then I ran up the house and held up my fist as if to knock on the door. It was a threat I made very clear. I didn't know if anyone was home or if they'd even answer, but I hoped it was enough to deter whoever these freaks were. They screeched to a halt outside the fence, making revving noises as if he had his foot on the brake and was stomping on the gas. Zoe was shaking behind me, and I could barely make out a shadow behind the tinted window as they appeared to be shaking their fists at us. I caught the middle finger gesture as well as some choice words thrown at us. This dude was really yelling at the top of his lungs at us over the sound of his creepy-ass music. I was shaking too, but I stared right at where I thought his face was, trying to be as obstinate as possible, hoping they wouldn't think we were worth the effort. Finally, they turned off their music and slowly drove off, stopping ever so often, waiting to see if we'd leave the safety of the yard. Finally, they peeled off around the corner. We stayed there for about 10 minutes, shaking and breathing heavily, with fear and relief. We still had a while to go to get to the house, but there was no way we'd go there because then they'd know where we were staying. So we opted to go to Dairy Queen as planned and called my parents asking them to pick us up from there. We didn't say why, but we didn't want to lose our trust or privileges. Looking back now, that wasn't smart, but we didn't want them to laugh at us or think we were lying. The whole way to Dairy Queen, we always checked our backs and watched our surroundings until we finally made it. We didn't even want ice cream at this point, and opted for the amazing and refreshing Orange Julius instead. We never spoke of this to anyone, and when we got older we joked about it, wondering what kind of creepy crawlies were behind those tinted windows. Whether it was creepy killer clowns, or a deranged psycho trying to take people without consent. Thankfully, whatever the case, we never found out. After that, I became even more cautious than I'd ever been before. It saved my neck quite a few times. Never be afraid to do what's necessary to keep you safe, no matter your age, gender, or situation. Be aware and be smart. It might save you from a creepy ice cream truck killer one day. New York. Former New Yorker here. This took place back when me and some of my friends were doing some urban exploring. There used to be a country club called Westwood in Amherst, New York, that was shut down due to a cyanide leak out of their pesticide shed. We decided to go check it out at night, and after a decent hike through what used to be a golf course, we shimmied through a fence and made it to the main spot. There were a few buildings all locked up, and the old parking lot was being used by a car dealership to hold overstock, so we avoided that. We managed to find our way into a locker room and the old pool house, but didn't make it far into the main area. After we were satisfied seeing the overgrown area, we made our way back through the old golf course. However, on our way, we got stuck in real thick fog. When I say thick, I mean like a cloud touched down on the earth. Shining our flashlights into it, only made visibility worse, so after a few minutes of walking around blind, we hunkered down in a sand trap, waiting for the fog to disperse. While we're sitting and quietly chatting the night away, we heard something moving around the grass, and all suddenly became silent. We lowered ourselves and started to look around when we saw something. It was human-shaped, and it looked right in our direction through the fog. We were afraid we were about to get hit with some trespassing tickets when the weirdest part happened. It got low down to the ground and started making barking noises like an excited puppy trying to get you to play with it. It kept barking and yipping in our direction for a while until something else started running through the grass, and I swear this thing was standing up like a person not 10 minutes ago and bolted on all fours like an animal towards the smaller thing. We took the opportunity to haul us out of there until we were out of the fog and back to our cars. While I was running, I heard something like a rabbit squeal. Maybe it got to it. After that, we didn't go back, and a few years later the whole place was leveled for housing developments. South Carolina. Years ago, when I was a little boy, my family had gotten together for a sort of reunion camping trip. Even though we were in a park with accommodations and even a zoo, so it really didn't feel like camping. Regardless, we were all having fun and enjoying each other's company. Everyone knows that you can't go camping without some scary stories next to a campfire, so we did just that. My uncle tells a story that gets some eye rolls. My brother tries his best to be as scary as a 14-year-old can be when telling his made-up story, and for the most part, nothing really unnerved anyone. Eventually, my mother looks up and says, "Hey Mum, I know you have something spooky up your sleeve. Why don't you give it a go?" We all look up to my grandmother with anticipation, and she thinks for a moment before sharing her tale. A long time ago, before my grandmother and grandfather had any children, they were on the road driving home from a concert a few towns over from their home in Hickory, North Carolina. It was late at night, and my grandparents were tired and ready for some rest at home. They were driving through an old back road since the interstate highways hadn't been built yet. My grandma said she was drifting in and out of sleep in the passenger seat when she noticed something that shocked her wide awake. Just emerging into view was a bright orange light up in the road, which slowly grew in detail as they approached. There, on the side of the road, was a stopped car, completely engulfed in roaring flames, sending a column of smoke up into the sky. My grandma yelled for her husband to stop the car so that they could help, and as they pulled over, the only other car out there was also stopping to assist. With a deadly serious tone, my grandma said that when the car came to a stop ahead of the crash, she got out of the car and turned around to see nothing. The blazing vehicle had vanished. Dumbfounded, my grandparents slowly walked over to the spot where the car should have been, and yet there was no smoke in the air, not even a single scorch mark on the pavement. The other driver had also walked up at this point, and my grandma said all they could do was stare at the scene in utter disbelief. After some pacing back and forth and exchanges of, "Did we really just see that?" to one another, everyone gets back into their cars and resumes their drive. All of us around the campfire were cautiously in awe of the story, each trying silently to think of a rational explanation. My grandma was swarmed with questions regarding the history of the road, if there were any murders or burial sites, anything to try and connect a detail of the story to some sort of logical reasoning. Despite all the ideas thrown around, my grandmother just shook her head and shrugged. All she said was, "It's just another mystery we'll never solve, I suppose," and went back to toasting her marshmallows, and we never heard another detail. 12 years later, her words have stuck with me. I'm not only fascinated by the bizarreness of the scene, but it helps me feel like part of her still lives on. North Dakota. I have a few stories from my state that I'd like to share with you. This is one from a few years ago. I'm in my late 20s now, and this happened towards the end of my middle to early high school years. I'm the youngest of 3 girls, and both of my sisters went to college about a 10-hour drive away. My mum and I made seasonal trips to visit them, and this was one towards the end of the summer. We were about 1.5 hours away from my home city. My mum tends to drink a lot of Diet Coke when she travels, and generally, and this trip was no exception. However, one of her and my dad's rules for myself and my sisters was to never stop by ourselves at night for our own safety. The back end had caused a lot of issues, and it was one of the main reasons. But Mum had to use the restroom, and we had just passed through the final major city before my home one. So she hesitantly, and to my surprise, middle school dramatic shock, decided to stop and use the restroom that was around an hour away from our destination. We went through what needed to happen. She got out the car, and as soon as she did, I'd lock the car and she'd go inside. I'd do a quick look around, she'd use the restroom, she'd come out again, and I'd go in and take my phone just in case. She did this, but when it got to the 20-minute mark and hadn't come out, I began getting nervous. She hadn't taken her phone with her either, so I couldn't call her. When finally she came speed walking out the building, I prepared myself to unlock the doors and get out while she got in, so that she could lock the doors after I went inside. But while walking to the car, she was mouthing "no, no" while shaking her head with her eyes wide and putting her hands up as if to say stop. She got in the car, and before I could get out, she locked the doors and told me, "You're not going in, we need to leave now," and started up the car. Meanwhile, this random man had been following her out of the rest stop, and after she'd gotten in the car, he slammed his hands down on the hood and pointed at my mum, and we could hear him yell for her to get out. My mum reversed and sped out, and once we were back on the road, I was so scared that I decided I should hold my bladder, because my mum had told me that when she'd gone in, the man had been waiting by the front doors and tried talking to her, but she ignored him and went to the ladies' room. I guess she saw him from between the stalls. American stall doors are terrible when it comes to privacy in public restrooms, and the man had stood there the entire time talking to himself and muttering nonsense. My mum decided she'd just used hand sanitizer, and once done with the restroom, walked out. The man had asked her for a ride to his friend's house in the opposite direction of where we were going, and she said no, and he then asked if she had anything on her, and she replied no. She was still walking out the building while this was happening. She said he tried grabbing her arm, but she maneuvered away just in time and sped walked to the car, and that's when I saw him with her following. It was terrifying, and when we got home, we checked for any trackers on her car or herself. Since then, when I go on road trips that are shorter than 4 hours, I don't stop to use a bathroom if I can help it. If I'm with my boyfriend or my parents and or others on a longer road trip, I'll chance it, but myself, no way. The following story was told to me by my mum through her co-worker about her co-worker's daughter. Her daughter was travelling home for the holidays and had stopped at a gas station at around midnight. It was a 24-hour one, and her daughter was travelling home for college holiday break. She was attempting to fill up her gas tank and prepay, but her card wouldn't go through. She'd attempted to swipe her card 3 times before the pump machine told her to go inside and pay before pumping her gas. So she did, and she was somewhat frustrated, since if she were in her home city, she wouldn't have to. But she didn't have enough gas to get home. After she walked in and told the cashier about the issue, the cashier indicated he knew and that he'd intentionally done that because after she'd gotten out of her car to swipe her card, a man had gotten in the rear passenger side and closed the door behind her. She hadn't seen him and wouldn't have seen him until it was too late. The cashier said police were on their way and that he was going to have her stand behind the counter for her safety until they got there. I actually don't know if they ever caught the man, but I do know she got home safely and a police report was filed, and the cashier was thanked profusely by herself and her family. It definitely hit home for me and my sisters on the importance of not traveling alone at night though. This story is the story of Drew Jardin, a senseless tragedy. I'm not sure if you've heard of her. She was 22 years old and leaving her part-time job at Victoria's Secret in November of 2003 from the Columbia Mall in Grand Forks, North Dakota. That's when she was taken. She'd been on the phone with her boyfriend when he heard her say, okay, before the call abruptly ended. He received another call from her later that was only the sounds of buttons being pressed. Because of the second call and Drew not showing up for her shift the second day, she was reported missing. On December 1st, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a 50-year-old level 3 sex offender, was arrested in connection with her disappearance. Essentially, Rodriguez claimed to be near the area on the day Drew was taken. Police found receipts, cleaning solutions, knives and other items in his car, as well as DNA that matched Drew's. On April 17th, 2004, Drew's half-naked and face-down body was found in a ravine in Crookston, Minnesota, making the taking of her federal across state lines. She'd been beaten, sexually abused, her hands were tied behind her back, stabbed, and had lacerations, including a 5-inch cut on her neck. A rope was also tied around her, and the remnants of a bag were found, indicating the bag had been placed around her head. The coroner concluded she'd either died from major neck trauma, suffocation, or exposure to the elements. It snows an insane amount in North Dakota during the winter months, and part of the reason it had taken so long to find her was because she was buried under snow for months. I'm fairly certain they identified her by dental records because nothing else was identifiable except her teeth. Rodriguez did admit guilt for the crime in 2013 in a death row interview, but it was announced that the prosecution would no longer be seeking the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole on May 18, 2023. Legislation for Drew's Law was passed after this, which provides the public with access to all sex offender data nationwide. This was a horrible tragedy, and I can only hope Drew's family is healing and grieving as healthily as they can, and that Drew is at peace. The poor girl was taken far too early and far too gruesomely. I am from Waverly in Ohio, and I live in the backcountry. Back in 2016, I used to work in Hillsborough, a neighboring town from the one I live in, at the local Walmart. I didn't work at Walmart for very long, which is besides the point, but this happened in this specific town and its county, and I felt the need to share it. One night, between the months of October and December, I had worked a second shift and got off between the hours of 10 p.m. and midnight. I knew it was dark when I got off, as it was chilly out during the nights, so it was one of the months where it was cold, but not yet extremely freezing. There are 2 ways I could have gone to work, and I chose the easier option as always. The other way is honestly quite curvy and windy, and my parents would often scold me if I would take State Route 124 to go to work. Once I was off, I started on my hour's drive back home. It took me a little bit before I got to State Route 50, because Walmart is almost dead smack on the outside of town and is at least 5 minutes or so away from the road I need to take. So I was finally on State Route 50 after my long shift, driving east towards Bainbridge, and was right at Paint Creek State Park. There is a water treatment plant near the lake, right off 50, and if you're driving towards Bainbridge, it's on your right. If you're driving towards Hillsborough, it's on your left. There are some trees right beside the road as well, and they're at least 50 feet tall. Anyway, I could see the water treatment plant from where I was, and I was still a ways away from passing the trees because there's a slight curve in the road right as you're passing Paint Creek and are beginning to face the plant. It was a clear night with no stars or clouds in the sky, I don't even think the moon was shining. I looked up when I saw an orange ball in the sky. To describe the orange ball in more detail, it looked like Jarvis from the Iron Man series, and the specific color of orange ball was a campfire orange. The ball of light was perfectly aligned with the road, and on top of that, it was at least another 20 feet above the trees, which puts it at about 70 feet in the air. I watched it as I drove closer and closer to it. I even rolled down the window on my car to see if it made any noise. This was when I still had my silver 2011 Dodge Avenger, so it's been a while because I have a Ford now. The ball of light made absolutely no noise at all, and it definitely wasn't my car, because my car was up to date on all current mechanical work. I had switched off my radio, my cell phone was on silent, and there weren't any animal noises going on either, and everything was completely silent. As I kept driving, I eventually went under it, and while I could still somewhat see it, I still heard nothing. When I couldn't see it anymore, I kept myself from a total freakout and held my breath until I could glance back to see if it was still there or not. Once I was far enough away, I looked in my rearview mirror and side mirrors to see if it was still there, but it was gone. It had completely vanished. The farther I got, I still did not see anything. I was thoroughly freaked out. It took a while to share this story. The first time I did, it was probably early 2018, to my dad and brother on a trip to a jungle gyms, where all three of us were trading scary stories. At first, my brother tried to say it could have been a helicopter. I knew it wasn't one, because one of those things makes all kinds of noises with their rotors, and, as I previously mentioned, the Oris ball looked like an orange Jarvis. He insisted that it was probably a helicopter, and so I asked him why it didn't make any noise. Neither he or my dad had an answer. I also told my best friend from another state, who had had a similar experience with an orange light anomaly. He was surprised that I had an experience with it too, and I also told my best friend, Emma, from college, probably a few months or so after we'd met at school, and she was really into it because we're paranormal people. My brother and I were recently talking about this incident, and surprisingly he didn't say anything about a helicopter. He seemed to think it could have been something else, although he's half skeptical. He has experienced a few things in his life he can't explain away, but he has to see it to believe it. Who knows what the hell it was? It's definitely left an impression in my mind, and if anyone has any information about an orange ball of light flying in Ohio, I'd love to hear about it. Oklahoma. The first home that I lived in as a child appeared to be a normal 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house. The outside was this cheery yellow, which could be why I honestly hate the color now, with black, wrought iron pillars on the porch. 1505 was the address, and unless you understood the significance of those numbers, you wouldn't understand the irony of it. My mother has a strange affiliation with the number 5, and that same number plays a strange part in the layout of this home. Upon entering the home, the front half of the house is split into 2 rectangular sections, the living room and the dining room. Off the dining room was a kitchen, and from there led to the back of the house. This latter portion of the house contained 5 rooms, each of their doorways positioned to form a star. Within the center of the star, there was a singular light fixture which came into play in later incidents. My parents moved into this house back in 1991. My father had worked at a job nearby, and the rent was affordable for that neighborhood. My mother, after moving in, noticed this rust-colored stain on the closet door. She and my father had sanded, primed, and repainted this closet door at least 4 or 5 times, but the stain kept bleeding through. This room gave my mother a weird feeling, and she found out there was a rumor about a child passing away in there. My mother, not knowing if the rumor was true, had a priest come in and bless the room. Also, to cover her bases, she had a pastor for a Protestant church come in as well to pray over it. Despite all her best efforts, the stain wouldn't budge off the closet. My parents ended up moving me into the master bedroom and replaced the closet door. When I was around the age of 3 or 4, I began to see things in the hallway outside my bedroom door. I've always been a bit sensitive to the paranormal for as long as I can remember. I had a babysitter who said I would just stare off looking at a space in the room and would then begin to cry. She would feed me, change me, burp me, but nothing would soothe me until I was removed from that room. Now, between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., I would see this creature underneath that light fixture. The best way I can describe this creature is that it was a mix between the Crypt Keeper and a grotesque zombie from an old B-rated movie. The humanoid creature appeared in a few different forms, but one commonality through was desiccation, greying cheeks that barely clung to its skeletal structure. There were parts of it that looked burnt. The hair, what little it had, was stringy. The eyes, though, I could never forget, because they were reminiscent of the burning end of a cigarette. Varying hues of deep amber, red and yellow, with bits of charcoal and black within it. The creature at first would stay in the hallway and just stare at me. Later on, it had moved to the foot of my bed. The bed that I had back then had a metal frame with these intricate swirls and bends that represented vines. The entity would stare at me from in between these metal swirls. It never came closer than that, but I understood that it probably fed off my fear. A few years later, my older brother started staying overnight on the weekends. This entity would still appear at the foot of my bed from time to time, but one night my brother and I saw something outside my bedroom window. There was a brief glimpse of a face looking in at us. It was pressed up against the glass and ran its finger down the window pane. The window had a screen covering it, making what we discovered the next morning rather baffling. When the morning sun shone through the window, we saw these streaks on the glass and the exact placement of the hand the night before. Eerily, these streaks looked like a smudged handprint, but it shouldn't have been possible with the screen in the way it was. We moved out of the home when I was 8, after my parents got divorced. Later on, as an adult, I became friends with a girl called Karen. When talking to her, I found out that Karen and her ex-husband Sam had almost purchased that very same home. Her husband had a history of dabbling with the occult and was very abusive to Karen. She stated that he was overly interested with buying that house. It makes me wonder if that house drew him to wanting to purchase it, or if it was purely coincidental. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's content. Certainly a lot of horrors from the States. If of course you did, you can let me know down below. Huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names are on screen now. But until next time, watch more content here. If you missed yesterday's, it was a banger. Feel free to check it out and tune in tomorrow for the big conclusion. Stay awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Good night.